Hello and welcome to the first episode of the MSICS podcast. I'm your host Moritz Kraska and I'm joined today by Dr. Eric Helms to talk about motivation and motivation in bodybuilding. Before we get into today's episode, I would like to give a brief introduction of the podcast and Eric, and I'll start off with the podcast. The name is MSICS, and MSICS is an acronym that stands for Mens Sana in Corpore Sano. And this is a quote in Latin by a Roman poet named Juvenal, who lived in the 1st and 2nd century after Christ and was mainly known for his satire. And this quote is a good example of the style he used to write in. The literal translation is a healthy mind and a healthy body, although the quote is a bit longer actually and says something like, if you're going to pray, at least pray for a healthy mind and a healthy body. Now, this quote has several layers to it, and this is kind of the reason why I find it so interesting and appealing. One being him questioning the utility of prayer. So, kind of asking, does it make sense to pray? Implicitly, then he's kind of questioning the outcomes that people used to pray for, which at the time very often happened to be money and fame, very much like today. And he's also alluding to the importance of physical and mental health as a foundation to grow from, so to speak. And yeah, like I said, this resonates really well with me. And we're not really going to talk too much about prayer as such on the podcast, but we're probably going to talk a lot about mental and physical health and how they go together, and also about the outcomes that might be good to strive for, good to build or to put as goals, put down as goals. And I think today's episode, where we talk about motivation, is very much in line with the quote and kind of questioning the outcomes that certain people associate with other outcomes. And I'm very glad to have Eric Helms on as a guest. Dr. Eric Helms is a pro natural bodybuilder. He is a natural bodybuilding coach. He's competed in a number of different iron sports, such as bodybuilding, unequipped powerlifting, Olympic weightlifting, and recently also in strongman. This is his in the field experience, and aside from that, he has a quite impressive academic background, starting with a bachelor's degree in fitness and wellness, a master's degree in sports nutrition, another master's degree in exercise science, a PhD in strength and conditioning, and he is a research fellow for AUT at the Sports Performance Institute of New Zealand. Aside from that, he's also part of a research review called MASS, Monthly Applications in Strength Sport. He is host, or at least regular host, of 2 podcasts. One, there he's always a host in the Iron Culture podcast. Another one where he's not a host on every episode, but a lot of them, 3MJ podcast, that I can only recommend if you have anything to do with bodybuilding. And he is a speaker, and I would say educator and thought leader in the fitness community, and gives talks and presentations all around the world. And we actually met at one of those talks or presentation that he gave on the preparation period of natural bodybuilding in Munich here in February 2020. And like I said, I'm delighted to have him on. We had a interesting discussion about motivation in bodybuilding and how that relates to certain populations. And I hope you can take something away from it and enjoy the discussion as much as I did. So without further ado, Dr. Eric Helms on motivation in bodybuilding.
Appreciate it, man. Thanks for that full introduction, man. I'm honored.
Anything I forgot?
Nothing that needs to be stated. I think it's all good. I've got a cat named Milo. He's doing well, and another cat named Bucky. Maybe we can leave it there, though, I think.
Okay, I think that's important to know. Okay, so I wanted to talk a little bit about motivation in sports or in bodybuilding. And I mean, we know that how you set your training up in terms of reps, sets, frequency, exercise selection, relative intensity, all that stuff is really important. And if you don't have those parameters in check, you're not going to progress decently long term. But aside from that, there's like a big underlying aspect of training that is going to ensure or not ensure that you actually keep training for a long time, which is motivation. And I think, yeah, there are different types of motivation and different reasons people are motivated. And so I would like to talk about motivation, like as a general concept in terms of in the scientific literature, there's this distinction between intrinsic and extrinsic motivation, and how that relates to specifically bodybuilding in comparisons to maybe different other sports, and how there might be a unique, I would say, clientele or population that is attracted to bodybuilding for the outcomes that are associated with it. So maybe to start off, do you think bodybuilding has a special type of motivational profile that it attracts?
I think the difference between people who want to improve their physique and have aesthetic goals versus people who get into competitive bodybuilding. I think generally you will see probably more people who find some elements of intrinsic motivation who get into competitive bodybuilding. And that may be because of the process they find themselves having to go through to compete in bodybuilding competitively. The contest prep period is very, very difficult. The rewards are pretty minor. You know, there's no money to be won. There is at the highest level, and it's a very, very small amount. And then if you were a natural bodybuilder, it's barely enough to cover the cost of flying to your show. So the external rewards are very few. The way you look as a natural bodybuilder, or I would say as a bodybuilder in general, is not necessarily something that is awarded or lauded by the general public. You know, being covered in really dark bronze tanner, shaving your whole body, wearing a Speedo and flexing, and trying to get to the point where you're leaner than most people would want to look with lines in places that there normally aren't supposed to be lines. I think there's fewer external rewards. So you will by consequence, if anyone has gone through the competitive process, you'll end up having more intrinsic motivation. But I do think that the goal of bodybuilding itself is one, or I should just say, changing your aesthetics, modifying your body. It's very easy for that to become for external factors, you know, social pressure to look a certain way, not liking something, and that's not necessarily, going to lead itself towards developing a strong intrinsic motivation to do something. So I think it depends on whether we're talking about competitive or non-competitive. And I do think that despite that aspect of competitive bodybuilding, giving people an opportunity to find more meaning and have a deeper attachment to it because it's so difficult with so few rewards, the process of competing can pose a challenge to people who might have been initially intrinsically motivated. So I think we'll have a cool conversation here about people who just want to improve their physiques for non-competitive reasons, and be able to speak to maybe some of the challenges that competitors have once they get wrapped up into the competitive scene, and how they find that sometimes kind of ironically sap them of their motivation in a way they didn't expect.
Right. Yeah, I like how you go into the distinction between, well, someone who does it as a hobby, recreationally. Like I would consider myself someone like that. Like
I really enjoy bodybuilding. I want to build as much muscle as I can. I like to get kind of shredded every now and then, like probably, well, still in the, for me at least, healthy zone, meaning, you know, probably good 8 to 10 weeks away from stage. So you don't have all the horrific hormonal adaptations that are associated with the last couple of weeks. And then, yeah, I really liked how you touched on, first of all, that probably people who are more intrinsically motivated are more likely to take part in a competition, in a bodybuilding competition. But then again, the competition itself poses a risk to that motivation by, well, I mean, part of the process that probably most athletes and lifters fall in love with is the progression of training. And one aspect, but I think a very important one. And that's something that definitely goes down the drain, depending on how you set your dieting phase up. Could be kind of early, could be later. Like even me, who hasn't dieted down to stage lean level, I've definitely seen significant decreases in strength for the main lifts pretty much. And so that's pretty much not taken away from you. You can definitely, and it's a big mental thing, how much you sort of let it take away from you, or how much you're willing to put into it to maintain your strength levels at some point. But yeah, maybe we should start, or I'd like to start off with on the other end of the spectrum, like people who are definitely on the extrinsically motivated side of things, who come to bodybuilding or who come to a coach or like a personal trainer and say, well, I want to be at X number of weight, I want to lose certain amount of pounds, and I want to have a six-pack, but I haven't done anything for the past 2 decades. Like, get me there as fast as possible. What do you think is a good point to start someone like that off with? Like, where do you grab him, and where do you put him on a path? Like, where do you start?
Yeah, with someone like that, I think it's really important to listen to the language they use. Really ask a lot of questions, and it'll give you insight into why they're willing to pay a lot of money, commit a lot of time to a goal that before they came to you, they've invested no time into for 2 decades. Something that they say is important, but it's not something they've acted on at all. So I think also the verbiage you use there is also very common. Get me there. It's almost as though it's something that they're hiring you to do for them, like your contractor is going to work on their roof, rather than someone who's going to teach them how to train, how to live a different lifestyle, and to embark on something that should be a lifestyle that they don't do just for a summer to look shredded. This is now what you're going to be doing, because there's no way to maintain that physique unless you keep training and keep eating in a certain way. So that's the kind of insight that could be totally missed, and you could just give them a quote unquote transformation plan where really nothing's transformed except the way they look, and they get there, and then that was just a story they could tell and pictures they could show, but they'll be hiring some other trainer in 5 years when they've been not training for 4.5. So to avoid that, I think that needs to be spoken to some degree. So asking a lot of questions. There's techniques from motivational interviewing, which I would highly recommend, where essentially what you're trying to do is find out and help them put words to what they're doing, or why they want to do what they want to do. What is the deepest goal that they can get to? What is the motivating factors behind their actions? It's very different. It's very difficult to change if you don't understand the underlying why. So there's a fair amount of things to understand here, and essentially, if someone is going to make a permanent change, they need to have a strong attachment to that goal. And if initially the attachment is something that is maybe a response to something they don't like about themselves, or social pressure to look a certain way, or it's an attempt to fix something that is actually not going to be fixed by the process of lifting weights, that probably won't be maintained. A great example of that is people who have lost weight multiple times. And a lot of people these days, if they're coming to someone for bodybuilding and they say they want a six-pack, it's going to involve fat loss and muscle building. So they'll be lifting weights to put on size, and you'll probably be supporting them with a higher protein diet, but there'll be at least phases of dieting cyclically, or something like that. And a lot of people, they want to lose weight because they feel like they don't have a sense of intrinsic self-worth. If they don't look a certain way, there's societal pressure. They think they'll be more attractive to a mate. They may feel that it will save a failing marriage. They may have just been shamed by a doctor or themselves or something like that, instead of having some kind of stronger connection to it. And what that connection looks like, it needs to be individually defined. But if you can't figure out your current perceptions on it, then you can't start to reframe that and tell a story that has a deeper meaning that someone would be able to hook into emotionally and motivate them forward. And this is a tough one for personal trainers, especially because what we're taught is that we need to have SMART goals, and the acronym SMART. There's a couple of different ways it can be, but typically it's like specific, measured, actionable, time restricted. But basically, is give specific numbers, a specific timeline. They need to be realistic. That's the R. I did a SMAT goal accidentally, and basically how much, when, how long we're going to take to get there. What are the potential obstacles we need to overcome? And it is a good plan to get a specific objective done. But if I recall correctly, it was borrowed from like business, and that's great if you need to meet a deadline with like a shipping company or something like that, or develop an action plan to get a business to be, viable after 5 years and supporting all of the owners and the partners and the employees. But and it may be really good to get someone from point A to point B, wave by, and then they go off on their own, but then they stop training. And I think that is what we often see, is that people are so invested in achieving the outcome. And that's what SMART goals do. They get you a very efficient path to achieve an outcome. And kind of parallel to intrinsic and extrinsic motivation is process versus outcome oriented goals. And I think this goes exactly along with what you were talking about. One of the things that can be harmed by the process of dieting down to get lean in someone who's relatively experienced is their strength. Their performance goes down a little bit as they lose body mass. Their absolute strength might decrease. If it's getting really tough, they might even see their relative strength decrease. By relative strength, I mean something like a Wilks score, an IPF score, some kind of strength metric that qualifies your strength relative to your body weight. That typically goes up during weight loss. As you get lighter, the amount of strength you lose on a bench press, a squat, or a deadlift is something that is not as much to make you actually weaker relative to your body mass. It's just you can't quite move as much weight, but now you're a stronger person at 83 than you were at 93, as an example. But anyway, if someone is wholly focused on outcomes, that loss of strength can be much more frustrating than it can be if someone has a broader card deck of motivation. So an example of how process and outcome goals can be problematic is, I'm going off a bit of a tangent here, but it's a good one. There was a study done in the 70s on preschoolers, I believe, and it was specifically on drawing and rewards. So they had 3 groups. I've talked about this before in other places, so if you've heard this, just smile and nod and wait, listener, and the rest of you can learn something while I tirade about research. But essentially, researchers came in and they split the groups of children into 3 groups who are all drawing on their own for fun. And they took one group and they told them, hey, you're now entered into a drawing competition. Whoever does the most time drawing gets a reward, maybe a sticker or candy or something like that. And the other 2 groups were not told anything. One was the control group, so they just kept drawing and they just tracked who drew the most, how long, and all these other metrics. And then the other group, they gave a reward without telling them they're in a competition. So after the fact, members of that group would get rewards based on how much they drew. And then they tracked how much adherence to drawing did people have. What was the control group's amount of who kept drawing? You know, because there's going to be naturally some preschoolers who decide they like to draw and they go, no, I don't want to do that anymore. I'm going to do play with the Play-Doh or something else, some other creative activity. And they found that in the group that was entered into a competition and given stickers, they actually had more recidivism from drawing. So less of them were drawing after they'd been awarded. And they, tied this into other research in the area, and the authors basically stated that, hey, once you give someone an award, they let that outcome supplant the process, even in something that they might have already previously liked. And I think that's an experience a lot of people have, competitive or non-competitive, but I think it's much more obvious in a competitive athlete when you are literally given a medal or a trophy or a placing or a qualification, that all of a sudden you start chasing the trophy, the medal, the qualification, when most likely a competitive bodybuilder is someone who really enjoyed lifting weights on their own, because we don't get to play bodybuilding in grammar school or high school. With something we typically fall in love with lifting, maybe as a side pursuit or strength conditioning for sport. And then as an adult, we purposely on our own go and seek out competitive bodybuilding, which means there must be a strong attachment to lifting and enjoyment of that process and a willingness to go do something that is not socially normal at all. So there's almost an assumption that is probably true in most cases, that if someone is competing in bodybuilding for the first time, they love lifting, they love the physical culture, they love something about the human body, getting lean, seeing changes, etc., the control. There's probably a lot that appeals to them. And to then be given an award and in that state find yourself more and more focused on the plastic trophy is quite tragic when you think about it, especially if it results in burnout. Now, that's not the same as a non-competitor, but the problem with the SMART goal, the problem with getting someone completely focused on the outcome, is that it basically becomes that medal or that plastic trophy. So you can get effectively the same thing if someone gets too focused on these external goals. And unfortunately, we're taught that as trainers. Teach them what a reasonable rate of weight loss is, poo-poo the biggest loser and then say, no, we need to lose 0.5 to 1% of your body weight per week, no more than a kilo or something like that. And then we tell them, here's how long we'll need, we'll come on these days, these are the things we'll do, we'll weigh you in regularly. And while I totally believe that what isn't measured isn't managed, and that if you do have these objective goals, that you do need to have some objective checkpoints. However, the person will absolutely not stick with these things if they don't find some love of the process. And that probably wasn't there in this specific example you gave, or the person would have never knocked on your door with 2 decades of not having done it, despite ostensibly having these goals of looking this way. So to figure out what that disconnect is, you have to start asking a lot of questions. So now I've kind of squared that circle. We're coming back, we're doing motivational interviewing, figuring out what is their, are they motivated out of fear? Is it a lack of something, or do they have a strong goal to look a certain way? If they have, a lack of self-worth, or they don't feel like they have value, or they're trying to fix another problem by looking better, then, ask questions to see if they really believe that looking better is going to solve it. And a lot of times people are smarter than we give them credit for. They'll realize that this is probably trying to put a Band-Aid on a gunshot wound, or maybe just not even a gunshot wound, but this is the wrong treatment for a different type of wound, and they may still, and that may prompt new goals, or it may prompt them to have to actually think about why they want to do this, why they haven't done it previously, and what it means to them. And that gives an opportunity to have a more intrinsic connection. So for those who are listening and going, well, what the hell is an extrinsic or an intrinsic goal here? Something that is intrinsic means it comes from within. You derive value from it. And it's parallel to a a process-oriented goal. So intrinsic motivation and process-oriented goals kind of go hand in hand. It means that the process would be that you actively enjoy the process of doing something, and that could be in pursuit of a goal. And I'm realizing I'm monologuing here. Can I now talk about process versus outcome? You good with that?
No,
If I
that's
just keep.
cool.
Okay, cool. So there's other research that came out recently. Well, I should say more recent than the one from the 70s, where with the number of different tasks, they compared having a outcome or a process-oriented focus and how it affected the successful completion of those tasks. And this was like the publication. They had like origami folding. They had a yoga class. They had something else, and then they had running on a treadmill. So the most relevant one to what we're talking about is running on a treadmill. And essentially what they did for this part of the study was the researchers asked the participants to guess how long they thought they would run for. And they said, stop when you want. Stop when it's something you just don't want to do anymore for whatever reason, right? And then they split them into two groups. One group was told to focus on the process of running, the things they enjoyed about running, whether it was the feeling, the hard work, whatever. And the other group was told to focus on the outcome. Hey, if you're running for performance, you're thinking about your time trial going down. You're running that race faster. You're getting further. If you're focused on health, you're thinking about, oh, my cholesterol is going to be better because I'm running right now. And if you're focused on fat loss, you're thinking about, I'm going to look great if I keep from this running. And in the group that was focused on the process, the experience, if you will, they underpredicted how much they eventually ran so they ran longer than they expected to. And the opposite was seen in the goal-oriented folks. By focusing on a goal that was obviously going to happen from weeks, if not months or years of running, did not motivate them very effectively to keep going for the current session, and they ran for less long than they expected to. So the title of that study was, I'm paraphrasing because I don't quite remember, but it was basically when focusing on focusing on goals undermines goal pursuit. And this is definitely something that's real. We have a tough time connecting our current actions to long-term outcomes. And it can actually be really quite daunting when you think about it, especially if you have a long-term goal. Imagine trying to climb Everest and you just started, you haven't even reached base camp, and you're thinking about getting to the top. That's why we're here. That's a very long distance to go. And I think there's parallels in physical goals and health and wellness. There is some data to suggest that among obese individuals, or individuals with obesity, I should say, that faster weight loss initially actually predicts long-term outcomes. And that kind of goes against what we've been taught as personal trainers, that, hey, you want to lose that 1 pound to 2 pounds a week. And now that is the appropriate amount of weight loss, or within the range for like maintaining maximal muscle mass if you're a bodybuilder. But bodybuilders are starting at a body composition that most people would like to work to get to, if they're doing it right. So the difference between someone with obesity and someone who is a bodybuilder is that bodybuilder might lose 10 kilos and be, like you said, insanely shredded and actually having negative symptoms of being too lean, and they don't even try to maintain that level of leanness. However, the first 10 kilos that someone with obesity loses may be the first of 40. And that first 10 kilos, if it takes 10 weeks to come off, man, I've got another 40 weeks. I've got a full year of weight loss ahead of me. This is super daunting. But if they lose those 10 kilos in let's say 6 weeks, this isn't too bad. Maybe I can do this. So it's one of those things where it builds belief. So that's just kind of a little more proof to the pudding, if you will, that if you're totally focused on an outcome without being able to enjoy the process, it can be counterproductive. It can kind of short circuit that process. So it's so important when you first start working with someone to get them invested in the process and to have intrinsic motivation. Something internal is driving them. It's not purely, nothing wrong necessarily with extrinsic motivation, but extrinsic motivation without intrinsic motivation is almost certain to fail. It's just a matter of when. You can have amazing willpower and you can make yourself do things. And I think that's something we all understand with the coronavirus right now. There's a lot of people who are very intrinsically motivated, really love training, love bodybuilding, but are not enjoying training right now. Now, someone with decent intrinsic motivation, what I would say commitment to a lifestyle, that commitment will carry them through these periods of low motivation. They'll be doing their push-ups, they'll be doing their Bulgarian split squats, maybe not quite as frequently, maybe not with the same fervor, but they're still going to get it done despite the fact they've been on lockdown, stuck in their home, and maybe they can't get that same level of intensity. But someone who doesn't have that commitment, who is purely focused on an outcome, it's very easy just to throw up your hands and go, well, this isn't going to get me there. This is a waste of time. And the willpower will fade much more easily because it's not there. You're doing something for a specific time restricted outcome goal rather than this is who I am. I have a connection to this practice. And I much prefer to do it in a gym, but I'm going to train. It's just a part of who I am, which is something that intrinsic goals get wrapped up into identity. And that's a whole other discussion, but that can be a good or bad thing as well. If anyone's read James Clear's Atomic Habits, when a habit becomes something that's fully ingrained, it is no longer the habit being external that you talk about and look at over there. You start to say things like, I'm the type of person who does blank, or I'm a blank. And while I don't think your whole identity should be, I'm a bodybuilder, having that be a part of your identity, I think is important. I'm not the type of person who skips workouts. Like for me, it is almost abhorrent, the idea of me having a scheduled training plan that I wrote down to reach a goal, and then through my own just choice, I don't train. Like I just don't like that. Stands in direct contrast to who I see myself as Eric Helms. So that's the eventual place one wants to get to, that comes from having these process-oriented goals, and this joy and appreciation for the act of doing it, not just what you get from it, and this intrinsic motivation that we're talking about. And if someone isn't there, which they almost by definition aren't if they come to you as a trainer, there's got to be a lot of work to be done, and not a lot of telling, but a lot of listening. And then once you've done that listening, help them start to reframe, and ideally reframe for themselves who they want to be, how they are, and then help them along that process and be there for them so that they can have that time in the game to start seeing themselves differently and eventually say something like, I'm not somebody who misses workouts.
I think a mic drop would be appropriate right here, but I can't do that. Wow, that's a lot to unpack, a lot to digest. I think you made a lot of really good points. I don't think I can remember all of them, but the last point was, like, I think that speaks very well to the common misconception that fitness and a healthy lifestyle is all about practicing a certain discipline, discipline. And rather than that, it's probably a lot more relying on habits that you've entrenched over months and years to kind of keep you over water in a difficult time where you just maybe you don't have the same appreciation for the thing that you once loved because the circumstances have changed, but you're so used to doing it that it's not even an option not to do it. I think that's where I see myself right now, and with training in Corona. So far, I've only trained at home, and I haven't been enjoying it, and it's definitely been reduced. But just leaving it out is also not an option. So, and I think that's all down to habits, not discipline, for sure. I really liked how at one point you said an obese person, and then you went back and said a person with obesity. That's another thing, or the terminology here is kind of important. And I think Danny Lennon recently had a very good episode on terminology around obesity with the researcher. I forgot her name, but she is dealing specifically with that. And that's another thing that maybe using certain terms might discourage certain populations from doing or going down a certain road, pursuing a certain goal, because the self-identity that sort of is created for them by the rhetoric and the terminology is not conducive to them going into changing their habits and behaviors to a more healthy lifestyle, so to speak.
Absolutely.
And you want to, yeah. If maybe now we went basically into the SMART goals and how those might be useful and appropriate in a personal training or coaching scenario at a certain point, but they have to be complemented by a more substantial and a deeper meaning or understanding of the whole process. So let's say we've taken a client in either personal training or coaching scenario through a 6-month period of weight loss plus muscle gain, down 10 kilos, build 5 kilos in same time of muscle. Not very realistic, but just
Actually, with the beginner, man, happens all the time.
Yeah, maybe. So anyway, like we got him there, and he's kind of enjoying it. And like as a personal trainer, you should probably, on top of making him reach his goals, make the process enjoyable by, I don't know, making him do high rep squats, puking numerous times during training sessions. That might be a good
things
place
people
to start.
like. Yeah.
Exactly. But no, like choosing exercise that the person enjoys, choosing rep ranges that the client or person might enjoy. Those are maybe like strategies to slowly, build this intrinsic motivation. Now, maybe if we go a little bit further to the other side of the spectrum, so people who are in the sport forever, they can't think of not doing it. They always have 200 grams of protein every day, like if they train or not, they have certain habits established, and they're not going anywhere anytime soon, unless they, might also face circumstances that are detrimental to their intrinsic motivation, like constant prep. So, what do you think in general, like for lifters and athletes who have been training for a long time and they want to keep this part of their lifestyle, part of their what they do? What do you think some preventative strategies could be for that you can implement, even if you want to do a bodybuilding prep?
Yeah, I think it's very similar, but it's a little different. Like we've got someone with the assumption of they've been in the game a bit. They're probably not going anywhere. But one thing you do see among bodybuilders, even who have a strong attachment to the sport, is that burnout can get to them. Athlete burnout is a whole area of research, and it happens in people who are highly motivated, been in the game a long time, years, and they've developed a lot of grit and resilience and self-belief, but they can find that constant grinding, if they've set up their motivational perspective in such a way that they identify with it, they're highly attached, but it just becomes like, I don't like this. Then they get bitter and they can find themselves like, this is I don't want to do this sport anymore. Like it can feel ruined for someone if you listen to the language. And I think that's almost more tragic than someone who just never quite got hooked in because they couldn't keep up the steam, because to be someone who played a sport your whole life, fell in love with lifting, started competing, and you were defined in many ways by movement. You're someone who expresses yourself physically, who appreciates athleticism, pushing yourself and seeing what you can do. And then just finding that one day you love drinking this milk, but the milk just soured, it curdled. And there's nothing you could do to get it back. And they were no longer selling it at the store. You didn't want to go back to that store. That's kind of the experience of burnout. Anytime someone brings up bodybuilding, you're just like, oh, that ruined my life, but I liked it. It's a tough thing. I've seen it, and it's really quite sad. And they're the type of person who sometimes, I'll talk to them about how I feel about bodybuilding, and they either won't be able to relate to it, or if they do relate to it, you can see a spark getting reinvigorated, which means there was an unfinished chapter there. Someone ripped the pages out at the end of that book, and I think that's unfortunate. And many times it comes from having a relationship with the sport that has that masochistic element. You're joking about doing, 20 rep squats and puking and all that. And I think if you are, and this is where personal trainers need to understand that if they love bodybuilding and love hardcore stuff, that they're quite maybe a different breed. And I don't mean that as like don't pat yourself on the back. You're weird. This is a problem for your personal training. This means you can't relate to most people. You know what you like, which is great. Like I do love, like when I sit down and I write a training program, I used to read about training programs before I knew how to write them. I would get bought in to the idea that this was the going to unlock the next little bit of spurt of growth that I was going to get. And then I got really excited about the training. And I thought, oh, that's going to be hard. A 5x5. I'm going to be like, I imagined myself, getting my grind on, in the gym, getting a spot, having my post-workout shake, following a diet plan, all the little things that I get sucked in by the mystique or the aura or the kind of the cultural aspects related to the experience of doing this thing to get me to my goal. And if I had to do 20 rep squats, if I threw up, like that was all just a byproduct of that, and it pointed to the fact that I'm doing this thing I like. So that certain element of goal-oriented masochism was exciting to me. It was me forging myself in the iron. It was the heat of battle. All these kind of silly things we think of when it comes to bodybuilding that really get us excited. That may not apply at all to someone who just stepped into your office and who hasn't trained for 2 decades. You need to find the equivalent for them. What gets them really excited? And you can't find that out unless you go through the process of asking a lot of questions and them figuring that out. So yeah, it's very important to do things you enjoy. Because like you said, right now, with the whole lockdown from coronavirus, you're getting it done. It's not perfect. You're not super enjoying it. But man, I tell you what, I have certain days where I'm not that motivated to pack 20 kilos of a bar into the back of my car and 70 kilos of weight and drive to the local park and then do a yoke walk with 90 kilos and go do Olympic lifting in a flat piece of grass. Like I don't get excited about that part. I'm always appreciative once I'm out there and I'm in nature and I'm snatching and I'm like, hey, how cool is this? But the fact that I actually go out there and do it, it makes me grateful that I've developed this relationship with training, and it makes me appreciative, that it does sometimes need to be a discipline, but the fact that I have changed my self-perception and who I am in relation to lifting, and that I've developed commitment, and that I've figured out what really motivates me, means that when it isn't perfect, I can have the discipline to do it anyway and then feel good about it afterwards. But imagine if every session felt like I had to do a yoke walk with 90 kilos out into the park and do snatches on grass. That would eventually get really tiring. I think it might take me years, but I would eventually just be like, I don't want to do this, and that's not a good place to be if it's something you identify with and enjoy, because then you're starting to have this cognitive dissonance with your own identity, and that can really suck. And the biggest challenge, like you said, that most bodybuilders get to this on a regular basis is competing. Because the competition process at a certain point, the only thing that's going to carry you over the line is discipline. It is simply not fun. And you can leverage gratitude, see the changes in your physique and appreciate, oh my God, look at this. And you finally see the full magnitude of what you've accomplished in your off season, because there's no body fat in the way. Like when I competed in 2011, and most recently in 2019, there was a point in June in 2019 where I saw myself in fully shredded condition on a refeed day, post-workout with the pump, got some high quality pictures and good lighting, and I saw 8 years of work, and I went, holy shit, that's awesome. And that's something you just can't quite see on a day-to-day basis in the off season. But I've been struggling pretty bad, for most of that month and into May as well. And I kept struggling all the way through August. And then even during the reverse or recovery phase, where your body is still not back to normal and you're trying to pretend you have a normal relationship with food and getting back to life, it took me, I would probably say there was a period of 6 months from, let's say, May to November, where I was either feeling bad mentally, or physically, and trying to get back to either normal or trying to accept the fact that my body fat was fading away, or grinding to get lean, different phases in prep and after prep. And that you only get through that with willpower. which is something that is a limited fuel. I think commitment, enjoyment, loving the process are fuels that actually are not even just sustainable, they build on themselves. The longer you do it, the deeper that identity gets, the richer the relationship is. You find new ways to enjoy the sport. And things like injury and contest prep come along, and that's when you got to reach in your back pocket and pull out the willpower card. And I think that's an important consideration, because someone who is early in the game of bodybuilding and is very fresh with a sense of motivation, has a new identity, and they want to compete too early, that can really kind of throw a wrench in the burgeoning relationship they have, and really kind of knock them down and challenge them in a way that you really can't anticipate how much of a challenge that process is. And I remember my first contest prep, I looked up and I was almost 50 pounds heavier than I had been 2 months ago after the contest season was over. And I did not feel like a bodybuilder anymore. I felt like, I could force myself to do anything before, and I had so much motivation and grit to transform my body. And now I can't not eat cheesecake on a random Thursday. What happened to the bodybuilder? And that was very, very depressing. It made me question things, and it definitely took me backwards in terms of my relationship with the sport. But it also motivated me and spurred me forward now that I knew that was the case. So there are a lot of things that can be done for the experienced competitor. Like, think of competition like the sun and you're Icarus. You need to not get too close to it, and not too frequently, or you can burn and crash to the earth. So I think it's something I recommend is only compete at most every other year to give yourself time for that psychological and physical recovery. Doing things, only compete when you have the mindset of, all right, if I place last in this competition, it would still be worth it. And you might be sitting here going, well, now would not be worth it. Why would I train to lose? And it's not necessarily about that the goal is to get last, but this is something extremely hard. You're gonna have 5 minutes on stage whether you get first or last, and trust me, the good feels of that first place trophy don't last nearly as long and don't cut as deep and make you as happy as you nearly expect. If it's about personal betterment, not necessarily personal betterment embodied in 7 people's opinion that gives you a trophy, that's going to be a much more powerful motivator. So having a deeper connection, having that intrinsic motivation, enjoying the process as much as you can until the process becomes just kind of a grind, competing only when you've recovered all those fuels to baseline, if you will. Those are kind of the things that I do with my athletes, and that I talk about a lot, because it is a very grueling process, and burnout's very common. And when you do burn out, it's often you've been pushed to your ninth degree. You're in the last ring of hell. You're in Dante's Inferno, and you're like, screw this all. And it's not a good place to be, because then you don't have necessarily something to fall back on, or you always feel like you had that unfinished chapter. So I think it's really important to nurture your relationship with the sport. Don't become a stalker. Don't, like, as soon as you fall in love with it, follow it around with a camera. It's always thinking about it, sending text messages, calling every day, and then finding eventually you get the restraining order, which is that unfinished chapter, and you can't keep doing it because it was destructive. Rather, think of it as a relationship where you want to one day be sitting on a park bench in your 80s holding hands with it. So, it's always going to be there. It's not going anywhere. You need to have a deep connection to it. You need to learn more about yourself through the process. So I think for the competitor, that's the perspective you need to have, because it is very taxing and challenging process. And unlike many sports where you simply can't play it as an older person, and they don't have a league, there's no such thing as masters competition, and all the competitions are full of people in their 20s who don't have torn ACLs, or you've had too many concussions or whatever. I think people naturally find a life after competition with sports that don't exist after your 20s or 30s. You have to have a self-identity that goes beyond being an athlete. But bodybuilding, it's both a pro and a con. You can do it into your 80s. You probably should at least keep lifting into your 80s, ideally. And you can compete all the way into Masters 2, 3, 4, 5. However, you'll never get there if you don't figure out a way to make it mean more than that trophy that you might get.
Great, man. Cool, man. Thanks for those insights. I think we're getting towards the end here of your time.
Well, one thing I did want to say, because you brought up terminology and how I purposely reframed what I said from an obese person to a person with obesity. I think, and I've been there too, when we first started using in clinical practice, people first terminology, and instead of saying this person's overweight, you're a person with overweight or a person with obesity, and this goes across the board for everything, from medical diagnosed illnesses, be they psychological or physical, to disease states, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. And the reason being is that, like, easy one that I think a lot of people in personal training are aware of is the back pain. Like, people have back pain without any evidence of a problem anymore, and eventually they've had back pain for so long that it becomes something like they start to see themselves as, my back hurts, I'm a person with back pain, whether they vocalize it or not, and it gets wrapped up into their self-identity, their self-perception, their rituals, the way they deal with, move, they guard certain movement patterns, and this kind of cascades into then those movement patterns being weak and then experiencing pain for longer. And simply getting the person to the point where they can imagine a world where they didn't have back pain is actually difficult. And this is something that I think anyone who's been seriously injured can relate to. And the fear of going back to those movements, having kinesiophobia, like, oh, I'm really afraid of a deadlift because last time the deadlift, it put me down a dark hole for 3 months or 6 months or 3 years, So we can understand that the way we see ourselves is very, very important. And the way we think is in words. And so that means that someone who you trust, like a personal trainer who's speaking out loud and is supposed to be your mentor, if they say, you're obese, that's not really, I mean, it's probably not on purpose. It's probably not meant to be hurtful by any means. But it doesn't do much for someone who sees themselves as an obese person to shift it to where they see it's possible to change. I'm a person who currently is with obesity. But I would like to not be. If you're an obese person, how do you do that? It's a much more insurmountable change. So I think the terminology is important. Words do matter. I don't think we should be shamed for saying things differently. Like, I always struggle when I write academic papers to say with overweight, because grammar in my head goes wrong. That's not English, Right. I can say with obesity, but because that makes sense in my brain. But so that has nothing to do with my value judgment about a person. It's just the way I've spoken for many years. So I think I don't like when people go around, shaming others for having a slip of the tongue or saying what feels more natural in their speech. But I do think we should be aware that what we say matters. And it's not just the absence of saying things that might be, quote unquote, hurtful, but it's the possibility of saying things that are open-ended like that. If I do state that you are someone with a disease state, that's me saying you could be someone with something else. You're not Eric with obesity. You could be Eric with a violin. You know what I'm saying? Like you are a dynamic person. You can learn and grow and do many things, and that's the stance that you need to hold when you work with clients. One of possibility, compassion, understanding, and belief in the client. Because 99% of the time, they're not very good at holding that belief. Again, they wouldn't be coming to you to change their whole life if they knew how to find it in themselves to be different, right? So your job is to hold the space, to hold the possibility that they can be their wildest dreams, to help them dare to change, and to be an example of someone who believes that's possible, who has tools to help them change, and can help them unlock that part of them that will allow them to change, because they aren't at a point in their life yet where they believe that to be possible. So you holding that space, it creates a crack in all those defenses that have been holding them back, and maybe allows them to step into becoming something that they've always wanted to be.
I like that. And I think we didn't really explicitly touch on the topic, but this paints like a nice picture, I think, of a good coaching practice and what it should look like in terms of like, if we think about the terms prescribing versus guiding, like we have to get away from the prescriptive side in order for us to be able to appropriately coach the client and basically guide him down a path that's conducive to his own development. And that is also probably going to be the only way that we help to establish a more nuanced understanding of the whole processes that are involved in weight loss and lifestyle change and all that kind of stuff, instead of kind of painting a picture of, well, these are the behaviors you definitely have to check off. If you don't do those, you know, you're not going to make it. So being a little bit more, nuanced and understanding that different people need different kind of guidance. Some need a little bit more close guidance. Some people you can, I don't know, be more independent in terms of how they progress in their mind states towards dieting and towards their own lifestyle. I thought that was really good.
Thank you. Well
terminology is something I wanted to get into, and especially bodybuilding terminology, because there's so many terms that I think are maybe a bit too suggestive or a little bit misleading, or might foster behaviors that are not really conducive to the goal. And you've talked about several of them, like, for example, diet breaks, which is like a very vague and open term and might be interpreted in many different ways and whatever way suits you at that time. And I think you suggested something like practicing maintenance as an alternative. And I think there are numerous examples of terms that are suggestive, too vague, or whatever, and not really helpful in setting up good behaviors for people. But I think this is another big topic, and I think we covered a lot of interesting points on motivation. And I'm really glad that you came on. Really grateful for your time. And what I'd like to do is give a recommendation for you, because I know you're a fan of hip hop and rap, the whole culture around it. I know that. I'm not sure if you're familiar with the genre of battle rap as such.
Oh yeah.
Yeah, you watch it. You watch.
Indeed, I remember. It's been a long time since I've watched it, but I specifically remember Idea beating Shells on Big ET in the final round of one of their battle raps back in, that would have been like 2008 or 9 or something like that.
A long time ago.
Yeah, man.
So I would say that whole genre has progressed quite a bit. It's a lot more commercial now, but that hasn't really been to the, that hasn't done it any bad. It's only profited from it. And there's so many artists who are really virtuosos at what they do. They're great with lyricism, wordplay, and they're just, amazing with what they do with language. And I think if you ever have time, you probably don't, but if you do, you should check out a guy. His name is Rum Nitty, like rum as the drink, the alcoholic beverage, and Nitty, Nitty. That guy, I think even for academics who have their brain highly stimulated most of the day, this is going to be a different type of stimulation. And it might be interesting for you.
Rum Nitty, I will check it out.
I'm going to send you a YouTube link on that. And I have another recommendation. This is kind of random. I just got done reading a book. It's this one called Jaws.
Ah, okay.
By Sandra Kahn and Paul Ehrlich. And she's an orthodontist. And they talk about, the subtitle is The Story of a Hidden Epidemic. And it's basically about how the development of the jaw has a lot to do with the spread of airway diseases like obstructive sleep apnea, for example, or just mouth breathing is also a big topic, and how those relate to problems with sleep. kind of obvious when you think about it that if your airways are kind of blocked by whatever it is in your mouth that is, blocking the airway, you're not going to get the same quality sleep that you would if your airways were free. And underdevelopment of the jaw is kind of a very recent condition of the human society, and they have ways to treat it or ways to prevent it rather. And it's like, particularly if you plan on having kids anytime soon, I think this is especially interesting and important. But also just for developing good oral posture. That's what they talk about a lot, in order to prevent stuff like sleep apnea or just bad breathing during sleep, which will prevent good sleep from taking place, so to speak.
Interesting. Very cool. I will check them both out. Rum Nitty
Cool.
and Jaws.
Exactly. All right. So thanks so much for coming on. Maybe sometime in the future I can have you on again. It would be a great pleasure.
Be an honor.
And yeah. All right, man. Thanks. And I hope to see you soon. See you in the next episode.
All right, man. You have a good one.